So continuing in our discussion with Spengler, this is the second to last chapter of Volume 1 of Decline of the West. Chapter 10, Soul, Image, and Life Feeling, Part 2, Buddhism, Stoicism, and Socialism. This chapter also could have been called the Buddha, Socrates, and Rousseau, because this chapter addresses the phenomenon of the Socratic Man, which Spengler has inherited here from Nietzsche, and he takes Nietzsche's idea of the Socratic Man, Nietzsche's criticism against Socrates, and runs with it to generalize it into a theory that each one of the great civilizations in the period just before the breakdown of the Kultur phase, when it shifts from Kultur to civilization, in the intellectual phase just before it, there always appears on stage one or another individual who embodies nihilistic tendencies and a hypertrophy of reason, as Nietzsche says of Socrates in Twilight of the Idols. He has 12 paragraphs where he tries to distill his attitude towards Socrates that he had talked about in The Birth of Tragedy. He says that the Socratic Man represents the hypertrophy of reason and the one who begins to turn against the instincts in a culture, against tradition, and begins to sterilize it. With the light of reason, reason becomes no longer a servant of metaphysics or a tool to be used as one tool to help construct a big metaphysical world picture. It now becomes the tool for sterilizing and erasing and wiping out the metaphysical world picture. And so we can see these nihilistic tendencies precisely in the Buddha, in Buddhist India, and in Socrates, who appears about the time of Plato and Aristotle. That's their 18th century, and our 18th century is finished up with Goethe, Kant, and Hegel. And in that period we have Rousseau embodying, he's the first to begin to question the values that have been built up by Western civilization for almost 1,000 years by that point. He's the first to begin to return to nature, to question culture itself, whether it's a worthwhile thing at all, and to exhibit this kind of hypertrophy of the intellect, this kind of late megalopolitan intellect, although this is still within the phase of culture. It's still finishing itself up. The Socratic Man appears on stage as the harbinger. He is the avatar of reason and is the harbinger of the type of intellectual who will become common during the civilization phase, and who will become the average intellectual of the late megalopolitan, scientifically based civilization that every culture enters into when it shifts into the civilization mode. And so with each one of these systems of Buddhism, Stoicism, and Socialism, Spengler says, are built up out of a scientific worldview that just precedes it. The Buddha, for example, his entire system rests upon and is a variation of and a departure from the Sankhya system of Indian philosophy. And the Sankhya system, Buddha comes from the city of Kapila Vastu, and Kapila was the man who was supposedly the founder of the Sankhya system of philosophy. It's the first real system of Indian philosophy to depict the cosmogenesis of the world without any reference to the gods. It's a strictly materialistic theory, or at least for the Hindus it's materialistic. We might still regard it as metaphysical, in which the universe comes into being as the result of what are called three different gunas, and the three gunas are Rajas guna, Sattva guna, and Tamas guna. Rajas guna is the principle of fiery, passionate activity. Tamas guna is the opposite. It is the inertial tendency, the weight of matter to resist this fiery activity. And Sattva guna is in between them. It represents the principle of pure clarity, that is the desire to be achieved, of course, in yoga. And when the Purusha, which is the monad, the soul unit, comes into contact with matter, which in Sankhya is called Prakriti, once it comes into contact with it, it sets these three gunas in motion, and they begin to generate matter in the material body, and the whole world is thought to come into being out of the interaction of these gunas. So that's the Sankhya philosophy, briefly considered, and it has no reference to the gods whatsoever. But seeing as how the Buddha came from a city that is named after the founder of the Sankhya philosophy, we can see that his system initially bears this stamp of atheism and moves on into it with the initial idea in Hinayana Buddhism of the Four Noble Truths, that all life is sorrowful, that the cause of sorrow is fear and desire, and that there is a cure for this, and the cure lies in the attainment of nirvana, is basically, as Heinrich Zimmer says in one of his books, the attitude of the physician to a doctor, to a patient rather. So this is the attitude that the doctor has toward a patient. The Buddha treats life itself as a gigantic, sick, ailing patient. He's the doctor who has the solution to the problem. That in itself, Spengler or a Nietzsche would say, is significant, because already you've got a paradigm there in which intellect is linked directly with illness, with disease. And once you begin to move into this period, Socrates himself was thought of, as Nietzsche characterizes him, as a kind of physician who had the cure for the illness of Athens with the invention of the dialectic and the Socratic method and the spread of reason as the exterminating light. He was trying to get individuals, on the one hand, to think for themselves and to depart from tradition by questioning their own assumptions in the oral sayings that had been handed down, which were the knowledge-based system of the average Athenian, until Socrates began to question these oral utterances and to get the individual to think for himself. He is detribalizing the individual, as McLuhan said. He's cutting the individual free from the weight of tradition so that he can learn to think for himself. But as Nietzsche and Spengler would say, this cutting free from the weight of tradition is itself a nihilistic tendency, and it's beginning to pave the path for the sterilization of the culture forms and the beginnings of the wiping out of them. And then so we have Stoicism emerging out of Socrates as this sort of, as Spengler says, as the father, more or less, of the tendency that was picked up by Epicurus and carried on down to the Romans, down to Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, who are the last, who finished Stoicism off. And socialism comes out of Rousseau as its father, but also out of British sensuous theory, the materialism of the British. And so these are the three exterminating tendencies. And I think that we can also say, though Spengler doesn't say this, he does say that Confucian China corresponds to Buddhist India. And so we can also say then that Confucius is a type of Socratic man as well, although at first glance he appears to represent the very opposite, because he's an archaist. In a previous discussion I compared him to the Nazis, in that both were archaists trying to hold on to a form language from the previous Kultur period that is vanishing and is going to vanish, no matter how hard it's held on to during this phase. But the thing about Confucius is that makes him different, that makes him a type of Socratic man with a twist, is that even though he's preserving all the rights, and he wants, the age that he lived in was known as the age of the 100 philosophers, and as Nietzsche says, that in itself is problematic, because as Nietzsche in one of his notebooks says, an age in which there is a preponderance of mandarins means that something has gone wrong in a society. And once again, there's the link between intellect and disease. When you get sick, the mind lights up and wants to know what's wrong and begins analyzing the body to figure out what's wrong. Same thing in a civilization. When it becomes sick and there's a problem, then it starts producing a superfluity of intellectuals as a means of trying to figure out what's going on. And so, contrary to tradition, as Nietzsche and Spengler would put it here, too many philosophers is not a good thing. It's actually a sign of decadence. And I think Nietzsche was really the first to perceive this. That's not a sign of civilizational health at all. It's a sign of departure and decline and decadence. And so, in Confucius's day, this is known as the age of the 100 philosophers, and the nobles and princes, this is in the Eastern Zhou period, and the nobles and the princes were arrogating to themselves powers that they didn't have before, and there was a new kind of, there was a lot of young nobles and princes who were arrogant and haughty, and who did not want to practice the cult of the ancestors, and who were turning away from it. And so for Confucius, the ideal became the noble gentleman. The Chun Tzu is the one who has Ren. Ren is benevolence, piety, filial piety for the cult of the ancestors, performance of the rituals to the deities, and all of this good conservative stuff, except that, as Motsu, who was a general and a warrior and a statesman, criticized Confucius, he says, but the problem with Confucius is he doesn't believe in the gods. Already with Confucius, he wants you to perform these rituals in order to uphold the society, but he no longer believes in the actual reality of the gods. And so Motsu says, what's the point of this? It's like preparing your house in customs of being a good host in which there are no guests, or casting a net out into the ocean in which there are no fish. Why do the outward form of the ritual if that which it's meant to capture, namely the literal belief in the gods, no longer exists. And so Mozu himself believed in the gods but did not practice the rites. He didn't see any point, apparently. And that was his main criticism of Confucius. And I think that identifies Confucius as a Socratic man. What he's exemplifying here, what the Chinese should practice, is a bunch of dead, empty rituals, a form language that in his day, which is the 5th century BC, is already beginning to petrify and rigidify and is soon going to vanish, especially by the time Qin Shi Huangdi comes along under the Qin dynasty and establishes China's first universal state. Qin Shi Huangdi will then institute the burning of the books and a complete extermination of the intellect in China, and will institute a whole new system of standardization of weights and measures and coins and currency and writing and all this new technology, and he himself will liquidate the cult of the ancestors. Qin Shi Huangdi had no interest whatsoever in the cult of the ancestors, and he himself was a true nihilist in great Caesarean fashion. So I think we have Confucius as the example of the first of the Socratic men to appear in Chinese civilization. I think in Egyptian civilization, although Spengler doesn't say this, I think the first Socratic man who appears on stage here really can be said to be Akhenaten. The New Kingdom is the period of the Egyptian megalopolitan period, and Akhenaten is the man who begins to sterilize, not that he was a rationalist, he was not, but he's the first to begin to sterilize the culture forms and to begin to announce the beginnings of the ending, really, for Egyptian culture. He sends these armies of his soldiers out across the land to persecute the Amun cults, all the religion, the traditional rites and rituals, the burial of the dead, all these things that have been practiced for millennia in civilization, he outlawed and made illegal, and these things simply weren't practiced anymore, and he simply put in place this nihilistic sun cult in which the sun itself was to be worshipped as the god Atun, and he put himself and his family in the religious art where previously there had been deities. So that too is a form of nihilism, and it's a form of nihilism that, even though it became anathema to the Egyptians after the collapse of the city of Akhenaten and the reign of Akhenaten, after it collapsed, the Egyptians never really recovered from the trauma. It sort of introduced a permanent destabilization of their culture forms from that point on, because they were never completely certain of them. After the trauma of Akhenaten, it could never be, it's a little bit like after the trauma in the West after postmodern thought. We can never fully practice metaphysics with full confidence that we're doing something that we can stand on with complete security and certainty, because there's been so much skepticism leveled against it that it's no longer something that's self-evident. And so the culture is disintegrating itself as its mental immune system begins to attack any new metaphysic as though it were an antigen invading the body social and sterilized out of existence, killed basically. And so this is a kind of autoimmune system, a kind of intellectual autoimmune system that goes on here that the Socratic man represents in these three civilizations. And then he says that there is he goes over briefly over the morphology of the philosopher in the history of civilization. He says, the philosopher in the springtime period, which is the great period of religion, is always a priest. Whether we're talking about the Gothic monks or the Vedic Brahmins or the early Egyptian priests, the early philosophers are always priests. And so everything they say presupposes the religion of the time and depends on it and works consistent with it to contribute to the creation of a cosmology and a metaphysical world as nature picture. Then he says that in the middle period, the philosopher disentangles himself from religion, as was starting with Descartes, really, disentangles himself from religion and is usually a statesman or holds some kind of important political office. And mathematics becomes one of the main parts of the whole raison d'etre of what he does. It becomes a basic, constitutive feature of the metaphysical practice to be expert as well in mathematics, since mathematics is, in these days, of the essence of constructing a full-blown metaphysical world image. Then he says that by the time you get to the philosophers in the transition between culture and civilization, the philosopher no longer necessarily holds public office, and mathematics begins to drop out. He says you can first begin to see this in Kant, although Kant is the grand metaphysician who finishes off the Faustian world as nature picture, just as Aristotle does for the Greeks. Kant, nonetheless, for him, mathematics is already starting to become negligible. It's not an essential thing for him. Then by the time we get to Schopenhauer, and Hegel and Nietzsche. None of these men practiced mathematics, and none of them had the least bit of interest in it, and mathematics falls out. And when Spengler says that when mathematics falls out, philosophy is no longer practiced in the grand style. And so by the time you get to the civilization phase, the philosopher is degraded to the level of a mere academician, a Heidegger, let's say. I think you would think of Heidegger as the classic mere academician philosopher. Despite Heidegger's greatness, I don't think Spengler would have seen him as great. He would have just dismissed him as a mere academician. Spengler himself was not